without further ado, please welcome Eugene Puryear.
Well, thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone, of course, who's coming out. Congratulations to the friends and comrades with us from Cedar City with such a, I think, very important, powerful struggle, something that's really sweeping the nation. Everywhere you go, where I'm from, Washington, D.C., Cleveland, everywhere, people are trying to get rid of these mascots. So, thank you so much for waging that struggle. And thanks for everyone for joining us here today. Obviously, Black History Month, big topic, lots that can be talked about, of course. And I wanted to just start on a similar note as I started yesterday. To build off what Amanda was saying on Venezuela, just for people to note, you may have seen it by now, yesterday, this is not as big of news, but Juan Guaido has said that he is not ruling out authorizing U.S. military intervention. So I guess he thinks he's not only the president of Venezuela, but the United States too, right? He can just authorize the U.S. military to do what he wants, when he wants. But I mean, hey, if we're just proclaiming ourselves stuff, why not? And I think it's an interesting point to reflect on sort of in the beginning and thinking about Black History Month when we think of really the interplay between sort of state repression and radical Black voices opposing imperialism, especially in the modern era. In World War I, the government in 1917 deemed A. Philip Randolph the most dangerous Negro in America. He wasn't actually the famous labor leader that he became, leading the March on Washington. He was the editor of a relatively small newspaper at the time called The Messenger, which was a socialist newspaper, really magazine, monthly magazine, that was circulated in a small group of Black radicals, quite frankly. But it was obviously scary for the government in many ways, I think, to think about what it would mean to have the opposition to World War I, which is a little parenthetical to this, really take on the character of a potential social struggle if the Black population was able to become involved. I think obviously we know about Martin Luther King Jr., of course, and his opposition to the war in Vietnam, which was at the time, whatever, now everyone thinks it was great. Then not so much, right? He was widely vilified, and in fact, all of the mainstream media basically would approach that issue by saying, well, who is this Negro leader, as they would say at the time, who thinks he has the right to even talk about foreign policy? That was literally what they were saying. Like, who does he think he is to even be able to talk about this? Obviously, the role of COINTELPRO against the Black Panther Party and others. And we can also sort of fast forward to a contemporary basis right now. I think it's interesting that the Justice Department and the FBI whipped out this Black identity extremism designation, and it really didn't become a factor in the initial stages of the movement for Black lives, but only after it seemed that solidarity with Palestine was becoming a more important element of it, and the Movement for Black Lives Policy platform came out with some other sort of radical ideas, I think challenging some of the foundational realities of imperialism, and at least implicitly of capitalism. And then all of a sudden, what do you know? Then there's this whole new designation, Black identity extremist. We don't even know fully what that means because they don't say that much about it, but I did talk to a friend in Minneapolis who works in the Somali community there, which has been very heavily targeted around this issue of Al-Shabaab and so-called terrorism. And he was, because of his work with youth, invited to this countering violent extremism workshop in DC. So he was telling me a little bit about it, and he said, I asked the question, I said, I'm from a relatively progressive family, Black radical family, we have pictures of Malcolm X, other people like that. Like, would that be enough, like having a poster of Malcolm X and other Black radicals in your home, to be deemed a Black identity extremism? And like somewhat stunningly to me, the woman from the Justice Department was like, yes. So it gives you a sense of, I think, how the state often approaches Black radical, the Black radical tradition, if you will, as it becomes more involved in imperialism. And I think it's worth sort of reflecting on why that is. Like, what is it about sort of the Black population that seems especially damaging or especially dangerous to the U.S. ruling class over time? And I think it's an important lesson for Black History Month, just about some of the inherently radical nature of the Black liberation movement. But I think it speaks much more heavily to not just sort of the issue of the Black community per se, but the structural role the Black community plays in U.S. capitalism, right? I think obviously we all know sort of the history of slavery, and that's how, some of us, that's how we got here, more or less 400 years ago, to form the backbone of this new commodity economy that had grown up in the world. It's actually interesting to sort of reflect on some of this. The original colonies were considered failures until they figured out a way to make money, and that was selling drugs, right? Tobacco. We don't think about it like that today, but that's what it was. They found that like people like to smoke tobacco, and all of a sudden when they started smoking it in Europe, they were like, we need more of this, and then they became successful. So an interesting piece of the genesis of the economy, but that obviously sort of the structural role of Black America really was as this almost captive labor force that not only could you at that time not pay anything, but in the context of not paying people anything and having that sort of huge labor force bringing down the overall ability of all people, sort of except the very rich, to prosper. And I think it's actually worth noting that sort of the original removal of rights from African American people towards the end of the 1600s and the early 1700s was really all about locking Black people into a particular form of labor servitude, essentially. I mean, it's actually very interesting to read. There's an author, Lerone Bennett, he just passed 2 years ago. He's written a lot about sort of the early Black population in the 1600s and how they owned land and different things like that. And what are the first laws passed that are like racially based? Well, the very first one that really we can find is against interracial marriage and dating or anything like that, for obvious reasons, because as Edmund Morgan pointed out, it was not that strange, a major philosopher on colonial history, for the white indentured servants, the natives, and the Black indentured servants in the sort of between servitude and slavery to unite. So you really need to draw that hard line so you prevent people from having romantic relationships and children, which obviously does that, but also the inability to own land, the inability to own guns. I mean, so much of it was really about, we're going to put you in this position and juridicially keep you here. And I think as we go throughout the sort of history of America, it's an interesting piece because I think we often look at the question of Black oppression maybe individually, right, about individual racists and what they have done. And I don't want to downplay that role, because obviously maybe like the role of white supremacy and its sort of individual manifestations is obviously very critical, but I think it's important to look at it structurally too, right? Especially when we come to the contemporary angle, but I'll just keep moving historically here. You know, I think that when you look at the Civil War, the post-Civil War period, the Reconstruction period, it's interesting to see how quickly radical Reconstruction was really diverted, right? And so much of really the conversation in the post-Civil War period amongst the Black population was the desire to redistribute the land of the big plantations. So basically have sort of like a smallholder farm economy in these former areas, people kind of working their own plots of land, and pieces of that, as well as obviously the political power in areas of Black majority, which, you know, happened to a slight degree. But you see the land was never really reformed and different pieces like that, because very quickly it became clear, I think, to at least a certain subset of the Republicans that were ruling the country, that really to restart the economy after the war, the easiest way to do it, and perhaps the most lucrative way to do it for many of the northern business people who had supported the Union, was really just to return to a version of the slave economy. Obviously not the exact same thing. And it's interesting the way we look at sharecropping, rightfully very negatively, but the history of how it came together was really that you had this effort, the so-called Black codes, which people may have heard of, to really basically return Blacks to essentially a slave existence, and the kind of middle ground that the struggle of Black people against the remnants of slavery was able to reach was sharecropping, where you could have at least some level of independence and some ability to sort of make your own livelihood and not be completely controlled by these former plantation owners. There's a lot more to it than that, but I think the basic reality of understanding how crucial that Black population was as a lower labor force to this agricultural economy, which was such a pivot of the world economy and US capitalism. And certainly this also has a lot to do with the redemption and the ultimate sort of implication of Jim Crow, right? Which is really a control of movement. I mean, obviously it's a sort of a racial apartheid, but really the number one aspect of Jim Crow is to freeze the Black population. In the post-Reconstruction period, many people were moving around, looking for different things. A lot of people moved around looking for their families that they've been torn away from slavery. And then slowly but surely, people also started to look towards the growing industries of the North, not in a huge way until the mid-1900s, or really the early 1911, 1915 period, but still in a small way, looking for safety valves, looking to get out of the South, looking for something different. And really sort of the essence of the initial Jim Crow laws were vagrancy laws, for instance. And that is really the genesis also of convict leasing too, right? Like convict leasing was never a major situation, was never like a major form of labor, but it was a captured form of labor, and people who were captured in this convict lease system, put to work in the mines, in the turpentine camps, and all these different jobs that like many other people didn't do, but that were very essential to the quote unquote New South adopting a slightly more industrialized form of agriculture and sort of developing sort of new industries in ways that the finance capital in New York and London wanted to be able to exploit as this new modern economy was coming into being. And like the vast majority of people who were swept up into convict leasing, vagrancy, for sure. And well, quote unquote vagrancy. It could be really truly anything. Just walking down the wrong street at the wrong time in many small towns, really like that was pretty much how they would kind of teach people to stay in line, is they would just wait for someone to do something or be in the vicinity of something, arrest you, and sell you off into some convict leasing camp or force you to work for the labor of some other farm or some other planter for a low cost to pay off the fine that you had incurred by being a vagrant. And that sort of mentality you have that people would say, well, I'll just stay here on this plantation and work my little plot. Like there's no point in trying to go to Birmingham and work, you know, in the mines, because what if I get caught in one of the counties in between? Next thing you know, I'm in jail. Unfortunately, it's a very unfortunate title, I have to say, but it was 1935. There's an interesting novel about this called Georgia Inward by a guy named John Spivak, who is an investigative reporter. And he wrote the novel after he had done this massive expose of farm prison labor in the South. And I think it's a good example if you're curious about sort of like this aspect of Jim Crow, freezing labor. I think that you look at the quote-unquote new Jim Crow and mass incarceration, it's really sort of the reverse aspect, right? Like slavery, Jim Crow is all about how do we sort of maintain a specific labor force in a specific way, where I think mass incarceration really relates more to what do you do with a surplus population when you've decided that you are no longer going to actually provide a significant portion of them with the means to survive, or not much more than the absolute bare minimum means to survive. And I think we've seen that with, you know, quote unquote deindustrialization, with the sort of deeper story behind that, but really I think the structural unemployment that we see in the Black community, as I was saying to some comrades yesterday, and as I've consistently pointed out, in the State of the Union, Donald Trump, of course, said, one of my great accomplishments is that Black unemployment is at its lowest ever level, and that shows like how great I am and how great the economy is. I mean, there's so many different facets to that on so many different levels, but you know, one being that it's the way the numbers are done is a problem, and I'll get to that. But I mean, more importantly, these are trends that go back prior to the Trump administration. For him to even take credit for it is a little dubious. But beyond that, and I think many of us already know this, right? Like this quote unquote official unemployment rate, I don't want to say it's fake. It actually does have some value, but it really is sort of a smokescreen for understanding unemployment. It only measures a very small subset of people who are looking for work in a particular situation. But if you look at the labor to population ratio or the labor force participation rate, which basically what they are is like broader measures of who is employed and who's not employed, you know, what you see is they're about 60, well, I think the labor force participation rate is like 62, 63%. The labor to population ratio is like 58 or something right now. So about like 58% of people, or 61%, depending on how you measure it, of over the age of 18, I think under the age of 60 are employed, right? And when you compare those numbers to sort of the historical reality of Black unemployment, you know, surprise, surprise, they are not the lowest ever. But what you do see is they're about the same as before the economic crash of 2007. So what Donald Trump's employment numbers really do show are really just the fact that it's taken, what, now almost 11 years, it will be this fall, to work back up to the level of employment that you were at in 2007, which I think is also a statement about this so-called economic recovery. But on top of all that, as you may have heard before, sort of Black unemployment is usually almost just about double white unemployment. And that's pretty much true no matter where you go. And no matter what the actual level is. It's actually very interesting how it's almost exactly double pretty much everywhere. But on a more, maybe a more serious basis, or a more substantive basis, I think that the thing to really consider about that is in the places where there are large Black populations as well, right? Like a national average of unemployment tells you so little. And it's similar to the question that people ask, like, well, if the economy is so good, how come when people vote, they keep talking about the economy being an important issue, right? Because we don't all feel the economy the same way. What region you live in, what your education is, what your, I mean, there's so many different factors that determine your financial well-being. Like, we can live in some cities 3 blocks away from each other and have totally different relationships to the economy and totally different views on the improving economy, right? And when you look at the areas where there are large black populations, what you see is all of them have very high unemployment. Washington, D.C., where I'm from, not a state, should be a state. Hopefully you ask your state representatives to support D.C. statehood, but it has the highest black unemployment of any state if it was. It's like 13%. You look at a lot of places, Chicago, 8%, Mississippi, like 6.2%. So, significantly higher, sometimes not that significant, sometimes very significantly higher than the national average, but what you see, obviously, is that the average of places where there are very few black people, like South Dakota, no disrespect to South Dakota, but it's, I think, less than 1% of the people are black. The people who move there, since there's not a large black population, probably have jobs. That's why they moved there for their jobs. And thus, like, those states bring down the national average, but don't really tell you much of a story about black America. And, the fine-grained analyses of unemployment, even before the economic crash, in so many black communities are devastating. There's a professor at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee who's done several studies. In 2007, he analyzed black unemployment in Milwaukee and found it was about 50%. And among people between the ages of 16 and 25, it's like 80%. It was stunning. But if you've ever been to Milwaukee, that's like not a surprising stat, right? Like all you gotta do is walk around on the north side and it's like, oh, well, this is obviously true, right? And I think that's another reality of understanding sort of this phenomenon. But I say all of that to say, to roll it back to sort of the original point about the black liberation movement, about the black struggle, and about the issue of sort of the fear of the ruling elites of this struggle. And I think it is, and hitting on this idea of the structural unemployment is just one example of this, that sort of the struggle of black people, even simply for equality under the democratic system that we have right now, in and of itself calls into question the existing capitalist structure in which we live in. Doesn't necessarily discredit it out of hand on its face, but it at least raises the question of whether or not this is a system that can really actually provide that sort of level of equality. I mean, one thing I often point out to people using the labor force participation rate, it would take, to have 100% employment of just black men over the age of 20, you need to add about like 800,000 jobs in a month. It doesn't fully work out that way, but basically like that, right? And you can read the newspapers. I'm sure you guys see it all the time in the news. Like, we celebrate when the whole economy adds like 175,000 jobs in a month. And then you can just think about like unemployment more broadly too, outside of just black people, and get a sense of like how big the deficit is between what capital is providing and where full employment is. And then you just have to ask yourself a question, like, is this really a sustainable system if these super wealthy companies are just like not, investing on employing people? And if we have to employ so many more people, and also the fact that since capitalists control investment, some of the areas where you most need people to work, there's no real, and I mean, like, look at infrastructure, right? Like, we've been talking about how I think it's like 1 in 9 bridges in America could collapse at any time, which is like an unbelievable stat to me. If you want to be real scared about every time you leave your house, you should just look at the infrastructure report card put out by the American Society of Civil Engineers. It's very scary. It's all bad, and it's like a lot of money to fix it, and no one's talking about that. So, if you need like a horror movie night, then just go for that. You don't even need Netflix. And I think, like, but even beyond that, I mean, we think about teachers, but also, like cultural workers, artists. I mean, we don't really think at all about like employment in the context of what we need as a society, but just like where you can work and what people can do to create money, right? So in addition to like the gap between what's required for full employment, even just like the disconnect between where we direct people for employment in this day and age, and where people even conceive of their ability to gain employment, right? And I think that in and of itself really is indicative of what we see historically of upsurges in the Black liberation movement, really becoming the center oftentimes of major movements for social change that are vastly, some successful, some not successful, but that are obviously in many ways speaking to kind of total social overturns, right? Like, I mean, you think about not only the Civil War, but kind of the pre-Civil War period, right? thinking about the abolitionist movement, which ostensibly was about slavery, and I mean obviously was, but also if you sort of study it all around abolitionist circles, it becomes very clear to you like very quickly that kind of the center of all progressive ideas at those times were really kind of in orbit around the abolitionist movement and interacting with it, and oftentimes the abolitionist leaders were leaders of other progressive social struggles at the time. But beyond that, obviously, the struggle to end slavery was a massively transformative struggle, and really turned over, at least to a degree, this massive 100-year-old hemispheric system of labor exploitation that was really the center of the world economy. I mean, without slavery, there is really no capitalism at the end of the day. I mean, the Caribbean and the southern part of America really drove the commodity economy as we know it today. It's the center and the root of almost every industry. There's a good book by a guy named Joseph Corey called Africans and the Industrial Revolution in England, 1095 to like 1840. But either way, there's a few chapters in the beginning that are analytical, but then he just goes chapter by chapter through like shipbuilding, insurance, banking, and shows pretty much how the sort of modern structures of these things developing really was due to slavery. I think there's a book called The Half Has Never Been Told that came out 2 years ago, I think now, that's a similar piece about the slave economy in Mississippi, Alabama, at that time the so-called West of the United States, and the role in the creation of the modern credit system and other things like that. And I think that it's really instructive, I think, how foundational that was. But obviously, a key piece, and bringing in train with the Civil War, I mean, that was the original impetus for the growth of the early labor movement, although it wasn't directly attached fully to the abolitionist piece. But generally, that sort of motion was bringing behind it so many other new radical movements, the 8-hour day movement for sure, some overlap there, but really coming in the wake of this broad overturn of the Civil War, opening up the scope of what other changes could exist and could happen in society. And just a general point, obviously the civil rights movement sort of finishing to some degree some elements of Reconstruction, at least from a sort of legal democratic perspective, right? But then the Black Power movement sort of arising directly out of the wake of the so-called Black Power movement, I don't necessarily love that phraseology, coming in the wake of the civil rights movement, many of the same people speaking directly to the limitations of capital to solve the problems that were actually being raised by the civil rights movement. And as I consistently point out to people, I mean, honestly, I think all of us know about like the whitewashing of Martin Luther King, right? Like that in and of itself has almost become like a theme in and of itself, but the bigger issue to me is the whitewashing of the entire civil rights movement. And I think there's a number of elements of it that are relevant, but like it wasn't about integration, it was about freedom and self-determination. That's why it was the Southern Freedom Movement is what they called it at the time, not the Southern Integration Movement, right? It's the right to do what you want, be what you want, and choose who your social peers are gonna be, not have someone else decide what that's gonna be. But even from its very earliest stages, the civil rights movement was looking very directly at the issue of how sort of the political economy was related to Jim Crow racism and what was going on there. I mean, of course, the March on Washington was the March on Washington for jobs, peace, and freedom. Even before that, there were several other sort of pieces. A huge piece of the civil rights movement, really the rank and file, was working class blacks. In the South, it was the sharecroppers, the Fannie Lou Hamers of the world. And in the North, at least the initial big supporters were a lot of the smaller, left-oriented, heavily black working class unions, right? Like that's where a lot of the early initial support for civil rights was coming from. Certainly a lot of the early initial money. I mean, without a doubt, like if you look at 55 to 1960, there is no civil rights movement without like sort of the left influence elements of the black community raising money through the traditional sort of political circles that were tied to, boogeyman communism. But be that as it may, I think yet again, you can see obviously the late 1960s, or really the mid to late 1960s, early 1970s, massively transformative period in this country. The Vietnam War movement. There are some who say that the Vietnam War movement directly owes its existence to the Freedom Summer, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? Like many of the initial anti-war activists on northern college campuses became involved in the Vietnam War movement because they had left Mississippi after Freedom Summer and wanted to keep fighting, wanted to keep organizing, had been in solidarity with civil rights, and were able to transfer those networks, those skills, and a lot of that understanding directly into the early struggle against the war. And I think that's an interesting and a relevant concept as well. But I mean, the women's rights movement, I mean, so many things were sort of broken loose in the late 1960s because of what happened. You know, it was the civil rights movement that killed the House Un-American Activities Committee. Most people don't really know that story, but it's an interesting story. In 1963, SNCC had a conference called the Emergency Civil Liberties Conference, and they did it in conjunction with a group called the Southern Conference Education Front. It was run by a woman named Ann Braden and her husband, who had been longtime communist activists in Kentucky, Tennessee, and in the South. And all the liberal supporters of civil rights said, don't do this, don't deal with those people, they're communists, they're gonna manipulate you, they're gonna ruin the movement, no one's gonna believe you as like you're a positive force if you do this. But they decided, SNCC did, that they didn't care about red baiting, they were gonna go ahead and do it. And the civil liberties concept really took up the issue of the House Un-American Activities Committee, the challenges to civil liberties that were, you know, flying under the guise of communism. Like, of course, we think of McCarthyism as aimed at quote unquote communism. It was aimed at anything progressive. And in fact, the goal of McCarthyism was to label anything progressive as communist, to delegitimize it, and to close down that political space that had been opened up in the 30s and the 1940s. And I think that when you go one step further, in Freedom Summer, one of the big issues, right, was lawyers. Also in Danville in 1964 in Virginia and some of the other struggles, legally you're being brutally repressed. And SNCC turned to the National Lawyers Guild, which people now know, maybe have heard about. It's more of a mainstream-ish legal group. It's still progressive, but it's not as demonized as it was. But then it was like the NLG, those are straight up communists. If you deal with them, you're in trouble. People were saying they're gonna pull money. They were gonna pull all of the money from the voter registration and Freedom Summer if they used the NLG. And SNCC said, we don't care, we're gonna use the lawyers we wanna use, not that you tell us to use. And that made a huge impact and really sort of breaking open a lot of the anti-communist rhetoric that had existed in the United States. So we don't think about it like that, but you can also see civil rights opening up the issue of civil liberties. Again and again, we can come to the contemporary in the movement for Black Lives. I mean, I mentioned the issue of Palestine. I mean, I think that the movement for Black Lives since 2015 has done more to mainstream the issue of Palestine than anything in the past 30 years. And I think the fact that so many of the young Black activists who many people in the country, including many people of relatively moderate persuasions, were very inspired by and thought were great, right? Like fighting against racism, police brutality. Also then we're like, we have 100% solidarity with Palestine. I don't think, maybe it changed some minds, maybe it didn't change some minds, but what I do think it did is it started to take away the fear about raising the issue of Palestine in a lot of mainstream political spaces. And when that platform came out and said that Israel has apartheid, that was a massive firestorm in liberalism because so many liberal groups had been supporting Black Lives Matter, and then all of a sudden they didn't know what to do, right? And certainly, again, you can see just from the platform itself, whatever, I have critiques, it is what it is, but implicitly when you read it, it is a catalog of problems that capitalism has induced. And it does have some lower level solutions that are more legislatively oriented or whatever it may be. But when you look at sort of the solution points, you start to see that if you play that string out the whole way, it doesn't say it's socialist or anti-capitalist, but if you play that string out the whole way of reading that whole platform, reading all the things people are proposing, again, difficult to conceive of that in a way that doesn't start to raise questions about the capitalist system and its viability to actually address these issues that the movement for Black Lives is addressing, which is how is it in 2014 to 2019, there is still so much unbelievable racism in this country and so much sort of juridicially allowed racism through policing and the courts and so on and so forth. So again and again and again, I think we can see that because of, I think, the really sort of the very particular kind of pivot point that Black labor has played. And this is what I mean by structural, right? Because I think that there are many people who would, are at least in their own mind, very much against, racist disparities that exist in our society and would like to see them go away and generally probably try to orient their political engagement in a way that they think is meaningful in that regard, among other things, right? But I think many of those people are also reticent to really talk about capitalism and what that means and what it would really mean to upset the apple cart to have some form of equality for, not just Black Americans, but for all people, right? How do we end this extraordinarily unequal society in almost every single way? Income inequality, LGBTQ oppression, women's oppression, Black population, immigrants. I mean, we have so many divides, so much inequality in so many ways. To really address that, where do we go, right? And I think we know it takes us in a pretty radical direction. And I think that it's not that easy to just change something, even if you think it's wrong, if you're not really willing to address the root. So if you think capitalism is basically okay, but you also don't like racism, well, you're in a tricky spot when those two things come into conflict. They don't always. Sometimes you can address racism in meaningful ways without challenging capitalism, but those are often the most sort of surface level ways. Now, they can be very meaningful, but as John Lewis said in the March on Washington, what is the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford a hamburger? And those questions, I think, are very real for many, many people. The lived experience of a huge subset of the Black community, which is overall working class, the issues of police brutality, housing discrimination, slums, all of that doesn't happen in like different silos. It's like your everyday life when you wake up and what you live out, and they all sort of come together. So addressing them and fighting against them requires a broader perspective. And even if you are generally opposed to racism, difficult to do if you're not willing to look beyond the horizon. And I think that is the challenge for the ruling elites and for the state in this country, and why, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, you often see so much extra consternation when prominent Black figures come out against U.S. imperialist foreign policy. And I don't think it's, for any other reason really than I think the ruling elites know, well, this might start here, but where is it really gonna end? Because when we start to integrate issues of opposition to imperialism with the domestic social issues that we're working on, and the leadership is coming from a community who to really reach the full sort of goal of what these movements are, some form of freedom, justice, and equality, I guess, if we want to put it that way, you really have to challenge capitalism. You can see that snowball effect right there, right? And how that can become clearly very problematic very quickly. And I will say also in 2019, you have the moral reality of the Black struggle, of what many people have been inspired for. I mean, everything from animal rights to climate justice movements or whatever draw very heavily on the iconography of the Black liberation movement to inspire themselves. So that in and of itself, also just the truth of what the Black struggle has been and has been, also I think is very dangerous. And that's why you have to whitewash Martin Luther King. That's why you have to whitewash Muhammad Ali. They haven't fully found a way to whitewash Malcolm X, but I know they must be working on it. And the Black Panthers too, quite frankly. I mean, I actually once spoke on a panel in Congress about, it was after the Vanguard of the Revolution film came out on PBS about the Black Panthers, and it was I was on stage with all these Congress people. They had relationships like Bobby Rush, who was a Black Panther, of course, Barbara Lee, who was Huey Newton's secretary. So it was relevant for them to be up there, but it was not random. It was in Congress, in the Congressional Visitor Center, and the whole audience was Congress people, staffs, or whatever. And I was just surprised how kind of mainstream this was, even though the theme was very radical. And so you could see there, I don't think they fully succeeded in whitewashing. In fact, I have to say, the secretarial staff in the Capitol, if it really goes down, that's they were asking some real radical questions. And I was okay, the front desk is popping off. But yeah, they're working on it. They're trying to whitewash it, trying to find a way, because they know what it really means and what it can do and how much it's inspired so many people already to take up radical causes, to look at different things. I would say it's somewhat problematic for the ruling elites. You think about Black identity extremism, that Assata Shakur is the patron saint of the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, that is not good for them. Just read Assata's memoir, and you will know right away that is very dangerous. And she's still in exile. She has an extremely high bounty on her head. I think it's $2 million now or something like that. So you can see, obviously, keeping her out of the country is crucial. So, I'll sort of wrap up by saying that. I think that in sort of Black History Month, what are the things to think about, remember, reflect on? I think it's this inexorable radicalism of the Black liberation movement, which in and of itself is deeply heterogeneous. There's no one trend that I think has ever been dominant, political or ideological, and for the entire width and breadth of the Black liberation experience in America. But even in that sort of heterogeneity, the sort of just general flow of that river, that stream, has this sort of inexorable radicalism to it. And so many of the the challenges that the Black community continues to face are so deeply rooted, so deeply baked into the system. It's hard to think about the resolution without thinking about the system, and I think that's something to reflect on. I think the history of Black America is, in many ways, the history of the construction of capitalism and imperialism in America, and I think Black liberation and Black equality is, in many ways, the history of breaking down a lot of those foundational myths and foundational structures of capitalism and imperialism. We still have a lot further to go, I think, but I think it's something interesting to reflect on and to talk about, and I think that Black History Month is a great radical history month as well, beyond just the history of the Black community, but like reminding ourselves how radical this country has been at times, and how radical movements are like not alien to this country in any way, shape, or form, and that, in fact, many radical movements in America have been deeply inspirational to people around the world. I've been to Venezuela, I've been all over the world, and I can tell you, everyone knows Martin Luther King, everyone knows Malcolm X, everyone knows the Black Panthers, everyone knows Muhammad Ali, many people know Assata Shakur. As I said in the talk yesterday, I was in Mexico City over the summer, and I was somewhat surprised when I turned a corner at UNAM, which is the main university in Mexico City, and there's a giant mural that said Assata Shakur is welcome here, in Spanish, of course. But I was like, oh, okay. And so you can see that it really is, even beyond the United States, really a touchstone for so many radical people around the world, to know that people fought in the belly of the beast and like fought hard and, you know, sometimes succeeded, sometimes didn't, but I think it gives people hope. So I think that's also something to reflect on, is like the worldwide influence, I think, of the Black struggle and global liberation movements, and the interplay between them, which is always so significant. You think of the 1930s, for instance, the sort of radical Black communist movement we hear a lot about. You hear a lot about that, but you don't hear about how that sort of Black communist node in New York City was also the centerpiece where a lot of Haitian activists became trained and then went back to Haiti in the early 30s, mid-30s rather, and led like massive revolts in Haiti that were extraordinarily radical, maybe the most radical movements of the time, or the Oriente province in Cuba, which is the Black Belt of Cuba, as they say, where in fact, actually for some period there in the early 30s, they had like a Black socialist-oriented commune that had just a bunch of campesinos rose up with guns and just took over a huge subset of the country, deeply interplayed with the International Labor Defense. And they were going to Cuba, raising the issue of the Scottsboro case to organize Black folk internationally to support Scottsboro, but in that same kind of whirlwind, also helping them organize the labor and the peasant struggles in Cuba in and of themselves. So I mean, that's just one of many, many, many examples, but that interplay in the Black diaspora between a lot of radical forces here and abroad also, I think, is a powerful statement about internationalism. So I'll just leave it there. I appreciate you guys coming, and maybe we can have a little discussion.